St Giles Files.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the St Giles Files. Thank you for joining us.
We are talking about Byrne versus Chambers, the clash of the Victorian architects. So Jess is going to tell us a little bit about who these men are, and then Stephen and I are going to talk about the restorations themselves and have a discussion about restoration and changing styles. Stephen is in Chambers' corner and I will be defending Byrne. Who will win? You decide.
Now, what Ciara doesn't know is that we have a document in which we put down our arguments, and I have actually kept an argument to the side.
Ooh.
Oh, very sneaky. The kind of thing someone would do if they knew that they didn't have enough material to back themselves up, and just
Exactly
make
that.
you with sly tricks.
I will say that I had it in the back pocket, and then I saw Ciara's arguments, and she's kind of touched upon it a little bit, but I don't think she's done enough to really refute it properly.
Well, we will see. We will see. I
Indeed.
will just remind Stephen that as I'm the host of the software that we are using to film this and to record it, I have power of mute. So if at any point I feel like I'm not enjoying your argument or I've grown tired of it, I might just mute you, and that's an automatic win in my book.
Well, everyone else can decide, I think.
So William Byrne, our first William of the day, was born in 1789 and died in 1870. And he was restoring St Giles from 1829 to 1833. William Byrne came from a family of architects, so his dad, Robert Byrne, was also an architect, and he grew up and sort of pursued his education through Edinburgh and London, where he was taught by a guy called Robert Smirke, great name, who was later knighted for his work on designing the British Museum. So big old architect teaching him. Byrne himself returned to Edinburgh in 1812 when he was 25 years old, and he set up his own architectural practice. And a fun fact for you, an incredibly niche fun fact, is that in 1827 he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, which is, I think, usually sort of more sciencey scientists, not architects. So quite a cool little fun fact, I think. Now he is really well known as an architect. His sort of architectural work is called the Scots baronial style. So he was one of the pioneers of the Scots baronial style, and this style became increasingly popular through the 1800s. It was sort of like one section of the sort of Gothic revival in architecture, and it was heavily inspired by the Renaissance period in Scotland. Part of the reason for the popularity of that Scots baronial style that William Byrne spearheaded was that George IV visit, which I'll talk about a little later, in 1822. But essentially, after George IV visited, and when he visited, he had this like amazing, ridiculous, wonderful OTT all tartan get up to be like, I'm the King of Scotland too, Scotland, Scotland, Scotland. The sort of romanticization of Renaissance Scotland and like the whole romantic ideal of old Scotland was really, really heavily pushed. And that was also with the help of Sir Walter Scott and his writing. And Sir Walter Scott and George IV were actually friends themselves. So it was this whole sort of like network of powerful people, and they were helping create this romanticized idea of a sort of separate Scottish identity, separate from just like the north of Britain. So that was all tied up in why this Scots baronial style that William Byrne did became so popular. And it was all like turrets and crazy roofs and things like that. Now, he worked on lots of different churches, lots of grand houses, lots of different things like that, including the John Watson's Hospital, which is now the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art, Edinburgh, before retiring back to England. Despite all that romantic Scottishness, still ended up retiring in England. And yeah, that's William Byrne. Now, William Chambers, our second William, was born in 1800 and lived until 1883, and he was mostly working on St Giles during the 1870s. That was when his big restoration project was. He was born in Peebles and was the son of a cotton manufacturer. When the family moved to Edinburgh, William Chambers became an apprentice bookseller and sort of fell in love with the book trade, it seems like, for quite a long time. So in 1819, he set up his own bookshop with his own printer. And a year later, his younger brother Robert joined him and they launched a weekly magazine called the Chambers Edinburgh Journal. That was really, really popular. It said it achieved sales of like 90,000 copies, so pretty good. Maybe more than this podcast. Who knows? Help us get to 90,000 listener, guys. I believe in you. So Chambers Edinburgh Journal, and then later on they had a Chambers Educational course and a Chambers Encyclopedia, and he was quite a sort of popular, well-known publisher. This, I think, a quite nice little human connection to Chambers' work in restoring St Giles is that one of the aisles he restored was the Chapman Aisle, and the Chapman Aisle is named after Walter Chapman, who is one half of the duo Chapman and Miller, who made Scotland's first printing press. So that was in 1508 that first printing press was made, and their memorial was made few centuries later in 1879, and you can still see the little memorial plaque in that aisle today when you visit St Giles. So yeah, nice little human connection. Publisher turned architect, remembering older publishers and printing press pioneers. That's a P in that sentence. So a little later, after his publishing, between 1865 and 69, William Chambers became the Lord Provost of Edinburgh. One of the things he oversaw was the passing of the 1867 Improvement Act, which paved the way for extensive slum clearance in Edinburgh's Old Town. So he was all about sort of like lifting up and rebuilding the center of the city, which is probably one of the things that had him want to help make St. Giles sort of all shiny and nice again. And one of his big goals was to make St. Giles kind of like the Westminster Abbey of Scotland. So he wanted to be able to tell its history through these sort of Victorian plaques, memorials, windows, all that sort of thing, and really push up the different historic sides of St. Giles. Unfortunately, he didn't quite last to see the grand reopening. So he died in 1883, and he actually died only 3 days before when the reopening was booked to be, and when Queen Victoria was going to make him a baron. So it's a bit of a shame. Bit of a shame for Chambers, but he did loads for the building.
So I'm going to start defending Byrne, who before I started researching him didn't feel particularly strongly about either way, and now that I have looked a little bit more into his work, I feel more passionately about Byrne than I do about anybody else in my life. So
wow, that's a big statement, but I suppose in times like this, there's very few people to see and feel passionate about. Maybe
it's true. I've only seen 2 people for the last month, and now Byrne is the 3rd. Metaphorically, I'm not seeing visions of him yet.
Yeah.
We'll see.
I wonder if it's worth flagging at this point that we decided how each of us who would go first. And whilst I suppose my argument is the earlier in the sense of Ciara's is more of a revisionist position. Ciara's comes first chronologically, and these restorations can be so confusing that we thought it was probably best to go chronologically in terms of the cathedral rather than chronologically in terms of argument.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're both going to present the sort of bones of our argument and then have a bit more of a discussion at the end where it becomes a bit more heated, shall we say. Okay, well, I'm just going to get straight into it then. I'd like to start talking about the architectural necessity of Burns's work. And I'm going to start with a quote which sounds a bit like I'm shooting myself in the foot from the get-go, but it will all become clear by the end, fingers crossed. So this is a quote from Esme Gordon, who is an old cathedral architect, an architect for St Giles. I think he was working around the 1930s because he published a book about St Giles then. But he said, while it may be impossible to forgive Byrne for all that he did to St Giles, he saved the building from complete disintegration. And I think that is quite a large part of my argument, that unlike Chambers, who was working with quite a sort of sound building, Byrne was faced with some pretty serious exterior issues. And the context of that is between 1811 and 1817, the toll booths and Lucken booths were taken away from the exterior of St Giles. So they were almost like little market stalls that ran along the edge of St Giles on the Royal Mile side. And I do have a drawing of them, which I will upload with this podcast, so you get a bit more of an idea of them. But when they were demolished, the stonework of St Giles was exposed for the first time in a while, and it was revealed that the exterior stonework was pretty close to collapse. Now, it's also worth noting that at this time, the church was still divided up. So you had the New North Kirk, Tolbooth Kirk, High Kirk, and the police office, actually. And the General Assembly met in the Preston Aisle. And again, I've got some floor plans from before Burns's time, just before his restoration, that I'm going to upload, so you can have a look at them. So Burns had a pretty serious project ahead of him, and he also had the full pressure of the Burgh Council. So he was appointed as head architect by them. And the project had a lot to do with the fact that for the first time since, I want to say, Charles II's coronation, which was in... Stephen's given me nothing.
Sorry, I was reading something else.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Wow, not even listening to my argument. Stephen's just on Facebook. No, it's not true.
Hey, this argument is so rubbish that I can just, chill out, read something else, come back to it later.
This feels like a real tortoise and hare situation, I think. Stephen's just left, he's walked outside, he's by the sea, he's gone to the beach. It's just myself talking to the void. So I will continue. One of the kind of contextual reasons that there was a restoration at this time was that George IV had come to Edinburgh. It was the first time in a long time that any monarch had come to Scotland, and the public were beginning to realise that the state of St Giles perhaps wasn't quite up to scratch. Now, Burns wasn't actually the first architect attached to this restoration, and I think it's important to talk about his predecessor, because his predecessor laid a lot of the foundation for what Burn would later come under fire for. So it's a man called Archibald Elliot, which is a good name. He had almost exactly the same plan as Burns would later take on. And at the time, there was a lot of public outcry about what Elliot proposed to do. For the time being, the project was shelved. But when Burn presented his similar proposal a couple of years later, citing the necessity of preserving the exterior, it was accepted to the extent that Parliament gave it the go-ahead in the Improvement Act of 1827. So it's not just that Burn sort of wandered in with a toolbox and started knocking everything about. There was a huge amount of precedent and a huge amount of acceptance for what he was doing. I'd
just like to put my flag in the ground here, just to note this point of the argument. Nothing more at the moment, but
okay. Well, the thing about flags is they can be easily removed, but we will see. But okay, that's fair. Stephen has noted a point in my argument, and I'm excited to hear what he has to say. Where was I? So Burn was very aware of the criticisms levelled against Eliot's plan. People were worried about the removal of the southwest corner, and he kind of made the point that he was going to be able to increase the space between the Signet Library and St Giles itself, allowing for more passage into Parliament Square. So we see here that Burns isn't just thinking about St Giles itself, he's thinking about St Giles within its own landscape and within the context of the Royal Mile and the surrounding buildings. And that's a point that I think is really important. It's not just about the building, it's about its changing landscape. So the work itself started in 1829, and I have to point out that a lot of what I'm about to say borrows from the fantastic work of Joe Penny and John Knight, who have written a lot of great literature, which is available for people who work in the cathedral, so volunteers, for instance, and myself. John Knight in particular is a restoration architect and a volunteer at the cathedral. I am confident that when he hears this, he's going to back up my argument, as he is a fan of Burn, or at least is willing to defend Burn. And
I feel like you're trying to win the argument by name dropping here, Ciara.
And what if I am? I'm not going to deny that. I'm also going to point out that John Knight works on a Saturday and a Sunday, and on those days I always bring him a cup of tea and a biscuit. So whether he is supporting me because he believes my argument, or whether he's supporting me because of the biscuit choices I offer him, that's for him to say.
He does love a biscuit.
Does love a biscuit. I mean, don't we all? Do I come to work just for the biscuits?
Yeah, I mean, I'm currently on a little club, a Jacob's Club. It's only available in Ireland, I think.
Oh, very nice.
Delicious, really good.
What are we on? Currently eating a lot of those mint matchsticks.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, you can eat a lot of them at once, which I think is my favourite.
Should you, though?
No. Love that I would to talk about biscuits, and maybe we can do
Let's do like a supplementary one for like people that give us tons of money on our favorite biscuits.
Yeah, that's a great idea, and that could be available to you very soon.
Yeah.
So Penny and Knight used the phrase regularizing Georgian Gothic to sum up Burns's work. So Burns does things like he emphasizes the cruciform shape of St Giles, which was very much in fashion at the time. And he did admittedly remove some of the external profile. Whether St Giles has suffered from that or not is, I'm sure, something that Stephen, judging by his smirk, might bring up at some point. And he also removed a lot of the medieval interior. But he also re-roofed the entire building and crucially did some of the finer work reshaping and improving the windows, which previously were highly irregular. Now, if you know anything about the Chamber's restoration, you'll know that he was credited with the introduction of the magnificent windows that we see today. But it was Burn who quite literally laid the foundations for those windows. And in fact, the High Church Kirk was so pleased with this window work that much earlier than the first window was put in, so I think the first stained glass window in St Giles went in 1876, but in 1830, is that right?
74.
The 70s.
Yeah.
The High Church Kirk was so pleased with his window work, with Burns' window work, that in 1830 discussions were already being had about the reintroduction of stained glass windows. Now, the town council refused at that time on the grounds of expense. So is it simply a case that Chambers had more money than Burn did in order to realise the vision of stained glass windows? Possibly. So talk a bit about the south entrance and the two ancient chapels now. Unfortunately, they were lost in this restoration. The Albany aisle does survive as a very fine example.
No, you say lost. I'm going to use a very different term.
I'm going to say just lost to the mist of time. Where did they go? Who's to say? Do we have any evidence? Was it really Burn? Did they just disappear in the night?
Yeah.
Who knows? But the changes where they were lost to the mist of time were in response to a desire for a new royal entrance. And I will argue that the influence of George IV, is it here, might have had a sort of walk-on role. And the pressure to remove these chapels came from the barons of the Exchequer who wished for a new entrance. So it wasn't just that Burns decided he didn't like the look of them. There were kind of quite practical reasons for removing these chapels. And by the end of the restoration, there were only two churches left within the walls of St Giles. So I previously talked about how the church was divided up. Again, there's going to be floor plans available with this upload for you to look at yourself. And at the end, there was only the High Kirk and West St Giles. So already Burn had done a lot of the work in opening up the cathedral that Chambers would later be credited with. So I think that is kind of the structural part of my argument. I'm going to hand over to you, Stephen. I'm sure you have plenty to say, and then we can come back and talk a bit more.
Plenty to say. I mean, fortunately, Ciara, in introducing your argument, you've kind of made my argument. So if you would, well, the first quote you said was from Esme Gordon, suggesting that whilst Burn might have done some damage, if he hadn't done anything, he would have, the cathedral would have fallen apart. Now, you also mentioned a few other architects, and that was my first point, that, yeah, great, Burn saved the cathedral, but then who else might have done better? You said that Burn builds on Archibald Elliott's plan. Now, Archibald Elliott's plan was rejected because it was too dramatic and basically kind of just built a new cathedral almost. And the fact that Burn references it surely gives us a bit of a hint that he was referencing a plan that was roundly thrown out. Cameron Lees, and by the way, Cameron Lees' book, so he does a whole summary of St Giles through the ages, a good few years. Actually, it's just before Chambers' restoration, so he doesn't mention Chambers' restoration, but he does mention Burns' restoration, and he hates it. Basically every word that he writes is furious. And then he says there's a fella called, no, give me 2 seconds, I just need to find what this fella's name is again.
Can I quickly interject with something? So Cameron Lees was a good friend of William Chambers and actually had a lot to do with suggesting William Chambers give a large amount of money for the Chambers restoration. So whether he actually hated Burn or he was just trying to butter Chambers up to do a little bit of extra work.
Well, what I argue against my arguments rather than my source, I suppose I would suggest, in that I'm suggesting that Esme Gordon had it right, that Burn did save the building, but could someone have saved it and more? So, for example, Lees suggests that there's a Mr. Rickman who had ideas about St Giles and was heavily influential in the Gothic revival and that if Burns restoration hadn't taken place, then Rickman might have done a much better job if he was allowed. And I wonder how much that the council's hand was kind of pushed, that the cathedral was almost falling down, so they hadn't made a decision. And then Byrne came along and he said, "Oh yeah, great, fine, you just do it." And whilst he did save the cathedral, maybe if everyone had taken a bit more time and sat down and said, "Okay, right, who's available, what's what, let's see what we can actually do and what we should do." So that's my first kind of thought, that that maybe Byrne did save it, good, but maybe someone else could have saved it better. I think your statement about Lees is pretty spot on. I think his history sometimes wanes towards his personal biases. I just wanted to read this out because it's absolutely hilarious that his final statement in summing up the Byrne restoration is to say, "Surely never was more money senselessly wasted," which I just think is just, I think it speaks to what you were saying, that he's just furious with this man. He hates him. So he just kind of goes, "Yeah, he's a waster." But I think that kind of is, Cameron Lee's point is what I'm trying to build on, in that what do we mean by saying that Byrne saved the building when we're saying that so much of the medieval building was lost, as you suggested? Other people might have said it destroyed. Although actually, full disclosure here, last time Ciara got the argument that neither of us necessarily agreed with. This time I'm taking the argument that neither of us disagreed with. So whilst I'm saying that, I'm going to add a little plant a flag here as well, and we'll come back to whether the building was lost or destroyed. But I think the other thing I wonder is that it seems to me that Byrne never really tried to keep the building as it had been, that he was very much saying, we're saving this, but we're saving it in the modern context. So I'm going to do whatever I want. And where you say he regularized some of the windows, I might say he de-medievalized them, in that the medieval era is often characterized by irregularities. And so to make things regular is to bring them into a contemporary style of that era, but then is also to kind of change them from what they were originally. So I suppose there's that to think about. And the other thing that I think, one of the main things that I've always been a bit confused about, is Byrne's treatment of remains. Now, this is my kind of secret argument. And this is where Lees really goes to town on Byrne as well. The thing that I was going to say before I even read Lees was that Byrne destroys the Regent Murray's tomb. So the Regent Murray, which we may well talk about in a different podcast, had been buried there just after the Reformation. Beautiful tomb, really fantastic. And at the moment, now in the cathedral, we have a plaque, and that's the only bit of the medieval tomb that's left, just this metal plaque. And I can't really work out why Byrne would destroy that tomb in the inside. I mean, he was moving that area of the church around, but why not save it? He did save other bits of the church. So that there's these kind of little bits that I wonder why Byrne did. And the same for Montrose. Montrose, who's also had a tomb in the cathedral, his tomb was moved around and changed. And these are the things that I can't quite get my head around. Cameron Lees goes a little bit further in saying that this is, it's almost libelous, because he says Byrne desecrated tombs and sold lead coffins. So he says that Byrne took these lead coffins out of the cathedral and then sold them. And I just think, how can he get away with saying that? Because surely he didn't. But anyway, he says that. And the other thing that actually is often held up as a positive of Byrne's restoration is that he used these iron rods to shore up the cathedral, because the cathedral was pretty much falling apart. So Byrne had this innovative idea to use these iron rods. Now, that's fine and good in that moment. But Ciara, just before, well, actually, no, it was about 2 years before you started at St Giles, there was a bit of stained glass that we saw had broken. And when we examined the cathedral on the outside, we saw that a bit of stone had fallen away. And one of the really, really major problems for St Giles over the next maybe 20, 50 years is going to be looking at these iron rods, because they've started to corrode. And so where they corrode, then if you imagine you've got a ton of stone on an iron rod, it's just going to snap. And so this is the problem that we've got at the moment, that we're almost going to have to restore Byrne's restoration. Now, that might be a bit of a tricky thing to have said, because obviously that might have been the only way to do it in that period. It might have been iron rods or nothing. But I would say we're not having to restore Chambers' restoration, but we are with Byrne's. The final thing I want to say is to look at the background of Byrne. Now, he was very much a Scottish architect. His dad was an architect before him, and it's often said that he was heavily influenced by the Scottish baronial style. Now, I don't mind a Scottish baronial mansion. That's absolutely fine. They look great. But do I want a Scottish baronial cathedral, Ciara? That's what I need to ask you. And really, I think that's the kind of the nub of my argument, in that, to me, Byrne maybe was the man at the right time, but maybe the wrong man at the right time. It needed to be fixed, and Byrne has achieved that, but has he achieved it to the detriment of a lot of other things?
I think that is I think that's a very good argument. I feel like that is pretty much what people have been saying about Byrne, and there is a lot of it's quite fair. I did read the bit about the iron rods corroding, and then in true debate fashion just ignored it because I didn't really have a reply. But I think you've touched on a few things that will be interesting for debate. I'm going to reply to a couple of the things that you said quickly, as they were hidden from me. So I feel like it's only fair that I get a chance. A chance now. First of all, if this Rickman is so great, why have I never heard of him? If he had such a vision for the church, I'm sure the sheer conviction of his passions could have swayed the town council. But Byrne came highly recommended by other architects and went on to have an incredibly illustrious professional life until I think he died in 1870. So Rickman Schmickman, I will say to that. I guess more what I'm saying is I do see the point of that. I'm sure there were lots of other architects who maybe could have done a more sympathetic job, but I don't necessarily think that is Byrne's fault, and maybe that is something to put to the council as opposed to Byrne. But I think it's a fair point. And in terms of the remains, that's sort of something that I struggled with as well, because I think Byrne has this reputation as a bit of a hatchet man, but a lot of his work is quite considered. And so he seemed very aware of the importance of things like memorials and tombs. So why he didn't save them, or if it's a kind of administrative error where the records have just been lost and has sort of snowballed into a bit of a smear campaign against him, I don't know. But I will say to listeners who haven't actually been in the cathedral, who were horrified to hear of this, that Montrose now has a very lovely tomb.
Not tomb, that's a memorial above.
Memorial. That's true. He's got a lovely memorial. People still put flowers on it. And if you go on our Instagram page, you can see that I did a post about it yesterday. And the Regent Moray has got a very nice window. Also no tomb, but, they get something at least.
Actually, I'd like to do a little side note on here, because this is absolutely hilarious, and it might come to give you a bit more of an idea as to who Chambers was as a man. But Chambers was really in the business of trying to some degree, I think this whole argument comes from a smear campaign for Chambers, because he really just tried to make sure that he was seen to be undoing anything that Byrne had done. But my favourite thing is that he really wanted to find the Regent Murray, because he was quite a romantic figure. When it came to looking for Murray's body, he looked in the area that he thought the tomb had been, and he found a red-headed skull, a skull with red hair, and he decided that this was the Regent Murray's wife, because she had been documented for having glorious red hair. And then just next to the corpse, or the skeleton with the red hair, he found a skull with a huge cranium, and he decided in brilliant Victorian phrenological fashion, is the word I'm going to use there, the phrase, that this must be the Regent Murray, because Murray was a really clever man and he had a huge skull, and therefore this was the Regent Murray. So I just love that idea that Chambers was, almost this Victorian man claiming a mountain, by saying, "Yep, don't worry, we found him. He's here. Red-headed skull, big skull. There's the two of them." Anyway, that was a bit of a sidetrack, but yeah. Where were we before that?
Well, I don't know. I can't remember, but I think that makes a really good point in that Chambers, because he funded the entire Chambers restoration, I think that really meant he had control of the narrative in a way that maybe Byrne didn't. And so not only was he able to conduct something of a smear campaign with the help of his friends, with his help of his friend Cameron Lees, against Byrne to sort of really justify what he planned to do with the cathedral, it also means that, in the classic sense as a victor writing history.
And I'd like to build on that, in that not only are we talking about Chambers financing his own restoration. We're also talking about the council financing and hampering Burns. And I can't remember where I heard this, that one of the main arguments against Burns, is that he chopped off the southwest corner of the cathedral. Now, what I actually heard, I think, was it John? Maybe John Knight told me this. I can't remember. That the council stipulated that he had to chop off that part of the cathedral, that there wasn't any two ways about it. So it wasn't him going, yeah, I don't really like that part. The council said, for you to carry out this process, you have to give us better access into Parliament Square. And like you were saying in your introductory argument, the south side was exactly the same, that for an entrance to be built, Byrne had to do this. So I wonder how much it's a case of Byrne having quite a clear idea, but then loads of different bits being pecked at or changed. So his idea might have looked 100% complete, but different bits changed it, so it lost maybe 100% to kind of 80%, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because he was being financed by the council, there was much more of a financial pressure on him that perhaps Chambers didn't have. So maybe the fact that maybe he had to use Eliot's plan because it cut down on costs. I don't know, that's just speculation, but I definitely think you're right. He didn't have the same sort of freedom of expression that Chambers did.
I think what might be nice to discuss as well is their respective styles, because I mean, I suppose I touched on this a tiny bit by saying that Byrne was Scottish through and through, but I wonder how much the styles conflicting with the era might have meant that Cameron Lee's was especially harsh on Byrne's restoration. Because Byrne's restoration, let's be clear, is very much, I mean, I've made the analogy in our notes to suggest that it's almost the same debate as we're having with the Rennie Mackintosh building and with Notre Dame at the moment, where they came to the cathedral almost destroyed. What do you do with it? And I would say that Byrne was very much of the belief of saying, let's use our modern ideas, our modern thoughts, and let's make the cathedral reflective of that. Whereas then Chambers comes along a little bit later with his very Victorian, very Anglo-centric, what does a cathedral need to be? I mean, the very famous phrase that's associated with him is, I'm going to make the Westminster Abbey of Scotland. Now, I would say that Byrne is maybe looking at it by saying, I'm going to make Scotland have a Scottish cathedral, you know? So Chambers makes this very Victorian, very English, I think we can both agree, cathedral, whereas Byrne had maybe made a Scottish cathedral.
Actually, that's kind of the second half of my argument, so I'm glad that we are in alignment about that. Yeah, Chambers says this quote about it being the Westminster Abbey of Scotland, and my argument, I think, is why is that seen as a good thing? You know, St Giles stands alone, or at least it stands with other Scottish cathedrals and Scottish churches as having a totally different story and a different faith even to Westminster. So my argument is perhaps that maybe Burns is a little truer to the spirit of the time and the popular style of Scottish architecture. And if you look at St Giles within the context of the rest of the Royal Mile, you can sort of see that. So this ashlar coating that so many people had a problem with was actually to make it fit more into the surrounding newer neoclassical buildings around Parliament Square. And the West End, so you have this bit that is chopped off that we talked about before, that makes the West End, which is now the main entrance of our cathedral, very symmetrical, which was very much a sort of Georgian style choice. And yes, we have lost a lot of medieval parts of it, but down the road, kind of 50, 100, 200 years, having preserved Georgian architecture may well be equally important. You know, it's not just about older is better. And I feel like we touched upon that in a previous podcast. We were talking about the idea of St Giles the Cathedral, where people have quite a romanticised idea of the past, quite a romanticised idea of Scottish history. And I think that can mean that sometimes people can lose track of the fact that history and architecture is always evolving. And it's actually important to see that evolution.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly, the right point to be making. And to build on that a little bit as well, this debate is often categorized as Byrne versus Chambers. But actually, I think we need to look at it in its actual sense that Byrne is the architect, Chambers was the financier of the next restoration. So in actual fact, architecturally speaking, it's Byrne versus Hay, William Hay being William Chambers' architect. Now, Hay has been
that
all around.
A few people would not be called William, just to make our life a bit easier.
I think we will call this episode the Williams, because so Hay Chambers' architect, had been all around the world and picked up loads of different things. I think he spent ages in Canada, so maybe had a lot of Canadian ideas. And I think that's kind of reflected in the sense that Chambers wants someone that can build a cathedral, whereas Byrne maybe is trying to build something that reflects the area more. And the council has sponsored Byrne to build or to rebuild St Giles, whereas Chambers just kind of comes along with his agenda and just finances the whole thing and gets his architect who can build a cathedral. And I don't know, maybe that wasn't articulated particularly well, but I think it maybe gives us a bit more of a sense that Byrne's restoration was done for everyone's purposes, whereas Chambers was very much done for his own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think following on from that point, something that I've been thinking about quite a lot is the fact that if we see Chambers was really involved in the idea of making it a very aesthetically pleasing space, which is really important and is, you know, I appreciate it because it's a place that we get to work that is very beautiful. But is that the first job of a cathedral, to look nice? I mean, it is definitely an aspect of it, but in good sort of Protestant fashion, really it should be about creating a space that is safe for people to be able to worship in. And I think in that sense, perhaps Byrne was truer to the essence and to the true function of St Giles, whereas I think Chambers, maybe this is libel, but he's been dead for a while, so I think it's okay. Maybe Chambers was just on a bit of an ego spree and wasn't thinking about what St Giles should truly be, which is not about Westminster Abbey or competing. It's about maintaining a space in Edinburgh that has been vitally important for people for centuries.
Yeah. And I think building on that is a really interesting quote, again, from Cameron Lees. I spent a while reading his book just now, which he says, and Byrne, something like, he had the audacity to chop our columns in half with stupid gallery seating. Now, anyone that knows works in St Giles knows that seating is a real issue. We have so much trouble making sure we've got enough seats. And I just love the idea that Lees has walked in and gone, that column's rubbish. It's been split in two by chairs. And you think, this is exactly your point, that Byrne made a building we could use, whereas Chambers went, no, we're not having that gallery seating, it looks stupid, and took it down. So now we don't have enough chairs.
This is possibly going off on a bit of a tangent, but stay with me. Did you ever read Bill Bryson's travel books? I feel like they're quite popular.
I've read some of them.
Yeah, so he's well known as this great travel writer, but all he ever seems to do is bemoan the fact that all of these once beautiful towns have been turned into something else. These once great cities have been pulled down to create shopping centres and new offices and car parks. And that really annoys me, because the point of a city is to be functional for the people who live in it. And it shouldn't be about preserving every single crumbling piece of stone. I'm really, this is not something you would expect someone in heritage to say, but there you go. It's not always about maintaining every single piece of stone. It is about creating spaces that are usable. And so I like to call that the Bill Bryson argument. And I think it can be applied to this as well.
Yeah. I don't know what else you've got left to say, but I wanted to touch on the end of your previous point, because this is one of my favorite things. Whenever I don't do many talks anymore, but whenever I do, I love to point out this thing, because I think you touched on Chambers' ego, and I think some of this was his ego. You know, he'd reached a point in his life where he was stinking rich, and he's kind of looked around, as I think, you know, we can say many older men might, once they've finished their careers and they've got a load of money, and they say, well, what can we do? And he builds this really, well, I would say gaudy Victorian screen, but I think maybe some people like it, and it is very, very well done. But he slaps his coat of arms and his motto right in the middle of it, and it's in a really prominent part of the cathedral, just near the sanctuary. But I think it's so funny because for those of you who don't know, William Chambers is he has his own publishing house. He wrote a dictionary, but his motto is deeds, not words. And I think that is just fantastic, that a man who has written a dictionary has the motto of deeds, not words, and then also has the arrogance to slap his coat of arms right in the middle of the cathedral. So yeah, I think that's to me kind of summarizes who he was a little bit.
I don't know, maybe this is a stretch, but we talked before about how there were possible other architects who could have done the Byrne restoration instead of Byrne, and maybe they would have been better at it. But I'm sure there are a lot of people in the city who could have done incredible things with St Giles, but weren't able to just because they didn't have the money. And unfortunately, this one, I think to a certain extent, just does come down to funding. And that's probably why he was able to stick his own coat of arms on the wall. So I think that's probably a good place to kind of maybe wrap it up, because I think it definitely says something about the nature of his restoration.
Yeah. So what do you think our summary is then?
Well, I think we have sort of come to we've come to some kind of agreement, which is nice. Certainly Byrne he didn't do a perfect job, and there are things in his restoration that are a little bit heartbreaking are gone. You know, it would have been amazing to have ancient chapels still, more than the ones we still have. But he was a man very much under financial pressure, under pressure from the council, who were very involved in the work that he was doing. He perhaps wasn't able to work entirely under his own steam. And at the end of the day, the most essential part of his restoration was just to keep the building from crumbling around the ears of the people worshipping it. So I think from that point of view, he actually maybe did the most considered job that he could have.
Yeah, I suppose I completely and utterly agree with that. But then I wonder if Chambers has maybe left us with a building that has more an aesthetic consideration as well, and maybe more of a consideration to trying to make it look as it might have done in areas that it didn't necessarily need to be changed. And I think what we could agree on regardless is that we've ended up with a fantastic building, and possibly the two restorations were better than one.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think Chambers could have done his restoration without Byrne, but I'm sure glad that he did one, because it looks great.
Yeah,
But,
exactly. Yeah. And I suppose without Chambers, we would have none of the fantastic stained glass windows. So that's certainly something we can be incredibly thankful for.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel like we have sort of run Chambers through the ringer a bit, but that doesn't mean we don't appreciate the work he was able to do. And I think that even if he did try and make it like a Westminster Abbey of Scotland, it still very much retained a lot of its own Scottish character. So he didn't do too complete a job on that.
And hey, Westminster Abbey is a beautiful building as well. So, you know, if he's trying to do that in Scotland, then why not?
Yeah, it's again not saying anything bad about Westminster Abbey. I can't say I've ever been in, so I don't know what it looks like.
Really? Yeah.
Thank you very much for listening to another podcast with us. We've really enjoyed it. We will just say that St Giles has been really, really great about keeping all of its staff on, and it means that we can work on other projects like this one, which we really enjoy. However, if you would like to donate to us, that would be much appreciated, and we do have a link with this podcast that you can donate to. So thank you very much for listening, and we will see you in the virtual world next week.